In these areas of occupation, everything is ruined. There's no gas, there's no electricity, nothing works. You can see for yourself, what happened. And people take me around torture chambers and say I was sitting there when they electroshocked me. And then you write, and I sort of think I don't think objective is reporting what governments say, because all governments, including my own government, you can say kindly they put their best foot forward. You can say more harshly that they sometimes lie about things.
TWA Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. This is where we try and figure out the thoughts behind the actions that animate the arts, so to speak. And we've got... would it be okay to call you legendary Luke Harding?
Well, that would be flattering, but it's great to be here. And, thank you.
There's of course the legend of WikiLeaks, the Edward Snowden story, etc., which we leave for the trolls to write about in the under the podcast. But there's a new one, of course, which is the first one to come out about the war in Ukraine. Tell us a little about that. Let's begin with that.
I've been covering Ukraine for about 15 years. I was the Guardian's bureau chief in Moscow between 2007 until 2011, when I was kind of kicked out by Vladimir Putin and his spy service, who didn't like me very much.
Yes.
Actually, of course, I was in Delhi. I started my career in Delhi as a foreign correspondent. Then I was in Berlin. Then Moscow. And then actually, the last year I've been between London and Kiev, basically reporting on the front line, reporting on the invasion. I was in Kiev on February the 24th last year when Russian tanks came pushing through towards the capital. My book is, it's nonfiction, it's dramatic, it's terrible, and I try and tell the human story of people caught up in this awful war.
Usually people try and suppress the traumatic instances, but you are, of course, doomed to bring them out so that other people can live it and learn from it. What's that experience like, Luke?
Actually writing the book was a form of therapy, because the way it worked, I would spend 3 or 4 weeks doing kind of this intense stuff, writing for my newspaper, The Guardian, traveling around the country. India is a huge country, but Ukraine is a pretty big country. It's absolutely enormous. And from one side to the other is more than 1,000 kilometers. So I went pretty much everywhere. I talked to lots of people, some of them politicians, some of them ministers, some of them ordinary people whose lives had been torn up and close to the front. There is battle, there are booms, there is artillery, there are Grad missiles whooshing over your head. And my goal was to pull this all together and to explain where the war had come from and what has been happening.
Television has made the whole war reporting bit so sexy, hasn't it? There's the whole thing about bombs going off and people running, taking shelter, etc., etc. You, of course, have lived it. May I ask you to draw a word picture of what exactly it is like to be out there reporting from the front line?
It's a rolling horror show. What's happening in Ukraine, and it's quite interesting. A couple of months ago, I was on the front line in the south of the country, in a place called Kherson province. It was one of 2 really big Ukrainian counteroffensives last year, where they recaptured territory. One was in the northeast, one was in the south, and it's very close. It's a strange mashup between the First World War. I was with a group of Ukrainian soldiers, and they've dug trenches. There are stores for mortars. There are bedrooms where people sleep underground, and it looks like you're in some kind of film from long ago. And then you talk to some other guys, and they're playing with a drone, and they have a drone up in the air, and from the drone you can see they're looking at the Russian positions. The Russians are about half a mile away, very, very close. And then there'll be a boom, and you look on the screen, and you'll see a puff of grey smoke, and they've missed. And then, I carried on with my tour, and about 10 minutes later, they hit a Russian tank. And then you can see the smoke on the drone, and you can see the smoke over the horizon, over this line of wintry trees. And it's strange, it's surreal, it's dangerous, it's terrible. But I think what you have to understand is the Ukrainians are fighting for their home. They're fighting for their land. They're fighting for their country. They're fighting for for their wives, for their kids, and it's a real struggle for survival against what I would describe as an imperial Russian project to make them de-exist, to essentially to get rid of Ukraine, Ukrainians, and Ukraineness. That's actually what Vladimir Putin wants to do.
Sure. There's also this whole geopolitical thing about where petroleum is becoming almost as important as the missiles flying around. What are your views on that? The human aspect, the tragedy aspect, the war aspect of it, being enmeshed so inexorably with something like petroleum, which we take as an everyday thing, and that seems to have become a weapon in itself.
Well, I mean, Russia, still is a huge exporter of oil and gas. I mean, one of the biggest in the world. And Europe was its main customer. And the Germans, for example, they imported 60% of their energy needs from Russia, which now, given everything that's happened, looks like a kind of terrible strategic mistake. But one of the consequences of this war is that Europe is kind of weaning itself off Russian energy dependency. And I think the calculation from Putin is that actually, the Europeans, the UK, the US would be very indignant about the war, but would kind of flake because of rising energy bills. I mean, energy bills have really spiked in Europe and elsewhere. Mine has gone up dramatically. But actually, so far that hasn't happened. This kind of anti-Kremlin coalition has been pretty steadfast.
How do you see the world changing in this way? I mean, there's also ideologically, of course, there's been a lot of the inward-looking aspect that the world has been seeing, and now there's, of course, this whole thing about delinking from Russia and being a little more European in character, etc. How do you see the world shaping up now?
I mean, it's a really good question. I don't generally agree with Vladimir Putin, but I do agree that this is sort of a battle for ideas as well as a battle for territory. Yeah, sure. And certainly the Russian perspective, he sees this as a kind of great civilizational struggle where Russia is trying to reclaim territory that is historically Russian. This is what he thinks. I don't agree, but that's his view. And he even published an essay about that in the summer of 2021 on the Kremlin website. And he thinks that he is fighting against, Nazis, against the Ukrainian military. Recently, he's been talking, he and the Russian Orthodox Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the patriarch, have been talking about Satanists. They're fighting decadent Western Satanists in Ukraine. Sure. And it has almost a kind of medieval flavor to it, like a crusade. And on the other side, I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting for democracy and their right to choose and for self-determination, because essentially they don't really want to be a Russian colony anymore. They've had that for much of their existence for centuries. They want to join the European Union. They want to join the modern world. They see themselves as progressive, as digital, as contemporary. And the whole Russian project is to crush that.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, sometimes when you're reading newspapers or you're reading the narrative, it seems like we are in the middle of a dystopian George Orwell novel where the casualty seems to be the people. We seem to have become only numbers in a sense between the ambitions of a Putin and the energy needs of a Europe. The human tragedy of it is what you actually have seen on ground.
And that's what I try and write about in Invasion.
Exactly.
I mean, I sort of think. There are various stories I came across when I was reporting for The Guardian, which haunt me still. I mean, there are two places in particular which are worth mentioning. One is Mariupol, a long way away from Jaipur and the Literary Festival, but it's a port on the Black Sea, on the Sea of Azov, which Ukraine controlled, Ukrainian territory, where 400,000 people lived. And I was there in January of last year, just before the invasion. It's full of restaurants, full of coffee shops. It had a port, quite a beautiful city. And in the space of perhaps within about 6-7 weeks of my being there, the Russian army, they swept in from Crimea and they encircled it and they shelled it remorselessly. Yeah. Tens of thousands of people died. There are still bodies under the rubble. Entire neighborhoods have been ruined. We've seen nothing like this since the dark days of the Second World War. It's astonishing, and I felt I had to sort of tell that story. Another story I told was of Bucha, which is a suburb of Kiev. It's a sort of rather green satellite town about 30 kilometers northwest of Kiev. And when the Russian tank columns came rumbling in from Belarus, they got stuck. They wanted to go to Kiev and to get rid of the government, replace it with a pro-Russian administration. And they took it out on the civilian administration. And one story in particular, I went to see a woman whose nephew was taken away by the Russian military, tortured. She showed me the house where she'd peered over the fence, climbing an apple tree, and had seen how they broke his arm and were interrogating him. And they put him on their armored personnel carrier and drove off. And they told her, we will bring him back. And so for 3 weeks, she thought that her nephew was still alive. He was called Volodya, 26 years old. Then they chaotically retreated at the end of March last year. And a neighbor came around and said, we found a body. We found a body. And so she took me round the corner, about 400 yards away from where her house was, into an abandoned cottage with daffodils growing in the garden, a little dog kennel, a well, into a cellar. And we went down into the cellar and we found a bloody mattress, we found a children's toy, and they'd kept this guy there for 4 or 5 days. And one night they'd come down and they made him kneel and they shot him in the head. And she buried him in her garden because there was nowhere else to do. And what you have to understand is there were 1,600 civilians in the Kiev region executed in the same fashion. There are mass graves I've seen in the northeast in a city called Izum, where forensic scientists, after the Russians retreated, were digging up corpses. And you would watch, and you would look at the body caked in earth, and sometimes you would see camouflage trousers, and you think, okay, it's a soldier. Sometimes the hands had been tied together, so they'd been bound, then they'd be shot. Sometimes it was a woman. And this is why Ukrainians are fighting, and this is why they are deserving of our sympathy and support, because actually what is happening in Ukraine is genocidal. There's a genocidal aspect to it. And I think it's important that we as sort of thinking people, as feeling people, as literate people, do not forget and do not lose interest and change channel.
What toll does it take on you as a person, Luke? One, and two, how easy or difficult is it for you to remain objective in the way that you report what you see when you are faced with such human? I don't even have the word for what I need to use after human. So how
I mean, so I kind of, I write books, I talk about it, I go to literary festivals. In a way, that's quite helpful. I have quite a cool wife. I have children who are entirely indifferent to what I do, and have told me they'll read my books when I'm dead. So in a way, that's quite good that you come back and no one goes, "You're a great hero." They go, "Dad, make me a cup of tea." And so I think that helps on one level. And your second question was, sorry.
How difficult or easy is it to remain objective?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I think, my method is quite empirical. I mean, I just go and talk to people. I don't have an agenda. I'm not an ideologue or a dogmatist or a polemicist. I'm just someone who's curious about the world and curious about people. So I'll go to a town, I'll try and talk to the mayor, and then I'll talk to ordinary people in the square and have conversations and get people to show me stuff. And quite often, some of it's obvious. In these areas of occupation, everything is ruined. There's no gas, there's no electricity, nothing works. You can see for yourself, what happened. And people take me around torture chambers and say I was sitting there when they electroshocked me. And then you write, and I sort of think I don't think objective is reporting what governments say, because all governments, including my own government, I mean, you can say kindly they put their best foot forward. You can say more harshly that they sometimes lie about things. I mean, of course, you have to acknowledge what they say, but you have to kind of shape and you have to write what you see. And that's what I try and do.
Do you have coping mechanisms while you're in the field?
It's funny. I actually, so when after the first kind of really hard month after the war in Ukraine, so I came back from Kiev pretty shattered in March of last year. I mean, I was going there from December 2021 because I was certain that Putin was going to do a large-scale invasion. And my boss said, look, we think you better phone a counselor. So I phoned the counselor, and it was quite well done. It was done on a telephone rather than video, because you don't want video.
Of course.
And she basically said, look, do you abuse alcohol? And I said, no, I don't. No, I don't abuse alcohol. Because at that point I was writing a book, and you can't actually write a book and abuse alcohol. It's incompatible. And they said, do you have bad dreams and problems sleeping? No, I don't. I was exhausted. I was sleeping through. Basically, after about 5 minutes, she said, you're absolutely fine. Carry on. Actually, the one thing she did say, to be fair, is I said, look, when I see videos from the front line, when I see scenes of rescuers digging bodies out of rubble, especially children, which happens all the time because the Russians are raining down ballistic missiles on Ukrainian cities. I said, I react quite emotionally, quite quickly. And she said, don't worry, that's entirely normal. So I was quite reassured by that.
Yeah, normalcy. It's just the redefinition of normalcy is becoming powerful.
But the point is that that you keep your humanity, and that's very important. That's very important.
How easy or difficult is that to hang on to your humanity with your fingernails when you're confronted with barbarism, when you're confronted with this is a wanton act of aggression, is it not?
Yeah, and I sort of think, look,
is there anger in you? I mean,
there is anger. I mean, anger insofar. Well, anger perhaps it sounds as if you then kind of write in a non-rational way. I mean, I try and write sort of calmly and well, but I think the bigger issue is that I was, as I said, I was in Moscow for 4 years. I was eventually kicked out for writing about, asking rude questions the Kremlin didn't want me to ask, like, how much money does Vladimir Putin have? Yeah. Okay, that was one question. Another was, is the FSB spy agency, the successor to the KGB, responsible for the murders of people like Alexander Litvinenko, a Russian dissident? I wrote a book about him, who was poisoned in 2006 I've actually been drinking tea all the time with a radioactive cup of tea.
Yes.
And died in the most horrendous fashion. And so I was kicked out, and essentially there was a sort of relatively small group of us saying, look, this regime of Vladimir Putin, former KGB officer, is not merely domestically repressive. I mean, 10 years ago, everyone saw the photos of people demonstrating, they're clubbed over the head, they're put in a police van, et cetera, but also that it's internationally dangerous and adventurous, and that it wants to, in an era when in India, for example, and elsewhere, you think of settled borders, basically Putin wants to chew up the borders and recreate a sphere of influence across Central and Eastern Europe, like in Soviet times. And for a while, we were dismissed as hysterical, as warmongers, as neocons, as spies, as assets. I don't quite know. And now, of course, it turns out we were right, actually. And I think the whole world pretty much, apart from a few diehards, can see that.
So the told you so moments have arrived, finally.
Yeah, in fact, my wife was saying, am I allowed to swear on your podcast or not?
Please do.
Yeah, okay. She was saying, my book is called Invasion, but she was saying, you should have called it I Fucking Told You So. I fucking told you so.
Yeah, remember, journalists, they do mean things.
but I mean, the thing is, look, to be serious, I would not have wished this kind of awful, terrible conflict to have happened to prove that I was right. But actually, what we're dealing with is, and it's a warning to people everywhere. Any country with a leader that stays in power too long is a delusional dictator who has lost touch with reality and is living increasingly isolated and in a fantasy world.
That's a picture that we all need to be very, very afraid of. What's your process of writing a book, Luke? I mean, how do you start? What are your questions? Where is the head-scratching moment, whether you go right, wrong? What's the process?
I have no time for head-scratching.
No?
I mean, my kind of specialism is to write quickly. And so I wrote a book about Donald Trump and Russia called Collusion, which was the number 1 New York Times bestseller. And it was clear other people had the same idea, but I was determined to. We did it in great secrecy, and there were editions all over the world. Sure. And in fact, I came last time to JLF to talk about that. So it was. I mean, my book started the most obvious place to start, which was on February the 23rd of last year, the eve of invasion, when I was in Kiev. I was having dinner with a glorious, wonderful Ukrainian writer called Andrei Kurkov, who invited me for borscht, kind of East European soup.
Right.
We were discussing, I mean, he was writing a novel. He's abandoned fiction now. He's just doing nonfiction because of the war. He's published his own diaries of the invasion. And he was showing off these secret police files he had from 100 years before, when the Red Army swept into Kiev and started arresting various people. And he'd be given these files. And there was a real sense that we were on the moment of a sort of inflection point in history. I mean, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, calls it a Zeitenwende, a times turn, a transformational point in history. And you could feel it. It was almost palpable. And after this wonderful dinner party, I embraced Andre and I went out into the street, into this historic Kiev city. I looked at the dark velvet sky above me, and I took a call from a Ukrainian source of mine who used to work in the foreign ministry. And he just said a few words. He just said, the invasion will begin at 4 a.m. The invasion will begin at 4 a.m. And of course, you go back to your hotel and you can't sleep. And sure enough, about 4:30, you hear the first sounds of explosions on the horizon.
Sure. Wow. That's pretty much
and that's the beginning of the book. So to answer your question, kind of the book writes itself. Actually, it's almost as if there's a kind of auto dictator in my head, which makes me write it. And actually, it's sort of it just seems to come together. I don't know. I can do it, and because I know I can do it, I can do it.
Does
that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. When you read the book, it will. So you should. It's called Invasion. Investigative journalism is a bit of a walk on the sword's edge, is it not? And there are still people who want to take it up as a profession. So you being there, and we being in the world of social media and listicles, what would be your 3 to 5 points that you'd like to tell budding investigative journalists to maybe remember or avoid, whatever you want to do?
Well, first of all, if you're an investigative journalist, you're not going to be rich. Okay, it's. I mean, well, actually,
no money.
I don't know. I mean, people. I mean, a few people, Washington Post, famous journalists, have had glorious careers off the back of investigative journalism. But what's interesting is we all have this impression from movies that investigative journalists are men, that they have sideburns, that they go around knocking on doors, that they have sources they meet in garages. And actually, these days, investigative journalists are women as well. And they're more likely to be sitting in front of a kind of MacBook Air with a skinny latte doing investigative journalism than actually sort of pounding the mean streets of Washington. And so it's for everybody, first of all. But secondly, I would say it's good if you understand data, if you understand how to search, if you're good at geolocation, because I don't know if you've done anything on Bellingcat, this investigative outfit full of basically amateur volunteers who use all of the data out there, open source material, and come to some stunning conclusions. I mean, they identified, for example, the Russian sort of spies who tried to kill the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. Tracked their flights, pieced them together, bought their phone records. And just the other thing to say is collaboration. I mean, I'm in various secret projects at the moment, which are so secret, I cannot share them with your podcast. I mean, I would love to, but
for sure.
It's an omerta against doing that. But I collaborate on a regular basis with journalists from India, from the US, from Germany, from France, and we meet. We're like a little global Leninist organization, and we have these secret meetings all around the world, in Munich, in London, wherever, where we collaborate on a big story. And the people we write about obviously don't want us to publish, but they're typically their governments, they're oligarchs, and so on.
I can very safely say that sideburns is lost as investigative journalists.
I think with your wonderful kind of hirsute features, I think you could absolutely become an investigative journalist immediately.
At least on TV.
Well, no, we would like you in our group if you would join.
I would gladly join, except that I have no MacBook Air and no interest in thin lattes, so I'm not sure I'd fit in.
But the thing is, you're curious about the world, and in a way that's the other thing you have to bring to it is a curiosity, a kind of endless curiosity, and a degree of obsessionalism as well.
It's actually as simple as that, isn't it? Curiosity about the world. Are we enough? That is the question that we need to ask ourselves. We're being told increasingly that asking questions is an act of rebellion, but maybe asking questions for yourselves, on yourselves, and to yourselves would be a great first step. Luke Harding giving us a few hard facts that you might want to chew on as food for thought. Luke, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been a blast. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's the TWA Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. You want to know what will come up next? Well, you just have to follow our social media handles so we can flaunt some numbers as well, which is always lovely. Thank you for watching. This is the TWA Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to our channel now. We have a new episode out every Friday.